how did this even come about? Just let's even just start there. How did this project come about?
Yeah, it took us a long time. It took us 7 years to make. So we started in 2016, and it's very roughly based off my own story. Not exactly. It's more closely based off the stories of many of my closest friends, but certainly my own story as well. I grew up in a tiny town in rural Maine. So my parents, my mom, I was telling you, my mom is from Wisconsin, my dad's from Philadelphia, and but they were kind of hippies and they wanted to live in the middle of the woods, so they brought me to rural Maine, and I was one of the few Jewish kids in my high school, and I also I realized that I was queer when I was 15. I fought it for a very long time.
Of course,
I didn't accept it.
as we usually do when we
Yep,
first find
yep.
those things out.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. But as a young person, I didn't. It was very difficult for me to form a positive identity because I was made fun of for being Jewish. I experienced. I grew up in like Trump country, so it was like it was like 20% hippies, which was great, and then like 80% Trump folks, and that was the dominant culture in my public high school. And
Wow.
so both being one of the few Jewish kids and then also realizing at a very young age that I was queer. I later came out as bi and trans and stuff. It took me a very long time. It was very hard for me to kind of find a positive identity. And it was interesting for my bar mitzvah. I was given a bunch of very pro-Israel novels, and I went to Hebrew school as a young person, but our rabbi actually didn't talk about Israel that much. He was like in his 70s or 80s when he was teaching me, and so he was born well before the state of Israel was created, and he was a Zionist. He talked about it but very infrequently. To him, Judaism was just Judaism. It was the Torah. Israel was something else, but the important thing to talk about was Judaism from his perspective. And so Israel wasn't a huge part of my life. But then for my bar mitzvah, I was given all these novels, pro-Israel novels. And as someone who really had never formulated a really positive Jewish identity, again, it made me feel different. It made me feel embarrassed to a certain extent because people made fun of me. I read about these stories of Israel and I was like, oh my God, this is what it means to be a Jewish person. Like, so it was the story that's presented to us, the kind of traditional pro-Israel narrative. It makes Israel seem absolutely incredible, right? It
Mm-hmm.
basically is,
Mm-hmm.
it's the light at the end of the tunnel. After millennia and centuries of anti-Semitism, my family fled violent anti-Semitism around 100 years ago in Eastern Europe. Israel is seen as, the saving grace. It's finally, after all this oppression, we finally have our own state. And we
Mm.
finally have redefined ourselves and created this brand new Jewish identity, and we're returning to our homeland, right? It's the narrative that's given to you, and so it's an amazing narrative, especially as a young person. It's like, oh my God, I can be part of this. I can be part of this rebirth of the Jewish people, and I can be part of kind of creating, and being part of this amazing renewal. And so for a couple of years in high school, I became an ardent, Zionist, as pro-Israel as you can get. I began wearing a Star of David necklace around my neck. It became my way of connecting to Judaism. It really became my way of feeling like I was part of a community. Because I wasn't part of a big Jewish community, it made me feel connected.
Absolutely.
And then my senior year of high school, you could do it my random public high school in rural Maine. You could do an independent study. And I had this truly amazing teacher who the film is partly dedicated to. And I was going to do an independent study on the history of Israel. And you made a documentary at the end of it. I've been doing documentary stuff as an amateur for a very long time. And I was
So
going to do
that
one
you're
on the
so
history
you're
of
saying
Israel.
that was a part of one of the assignments at the end of it was to make sort of a documentary?
Exactly. And so the goal going into the independent study was to make obviously a very pro-Israel documentary about the history of Israel. But pretty early on, and he knew, he knew I was a really left-wing person. And at one point, early on, he was kind of confused that I was so pro-Israel because he knew I was a really progressive person. And he was neither Jewish or Palestinian. So at one point early in the year, he asked me, he said, do you know anything about Palestinian history?
Hmm.
And
No,
I
wait.
said,
So
no.
who was this that asked you this?
It was just this truly amazing teacher I had
So this was
in
the
my
teacher of your independent study
yeah, at my public high school,
of your
random
public
public
high
high school,
school.
and he
Okay.
changed my life
Wow.
in profound ways. Because I said no, because the narratives that we read never talk about Palestinians. They mention Arabs, if anything, and they only talk about Palestinians as an obstacle to the dreams of the Zionist movement or to the Israeli state, and never as a full-fledged people who have their own rich history and civilization. And so I said, no, I don't know anything about Palestinian history. So over this course this year, he gave me all these amazing history books, both by Palestinian authors as well as left-wing Israeli authors, that talk openly about the Nakba and the occupation. And it made me realize that I'd fallen in love with a one-dimensional story, with a story
Oof.
that was not the whole, was not everything, right? And how we learn about Israel is very similar to how we learn about America in public schools. And that we learn about America as this amazing brand new country formed from refugees, one of the first democracies of the modern world, but that there's no room for Native Americans in that narrative. And similarly, there's no room for Palestinians in the traditional pro-Israel narrative. So I became
Right.
fascinated by why I'd fallen in love with that narrative that's so obviously erased the Palestinians. And when I got to college, I met so many young people. So I began to change in high school, and I began to realize that I had not been told the full story, and that I was missing a huge part of this narrative. When I got to college, I saw so many young people who were like the main characters in our film, who had gone to Jewish day school, who had had a much more intense pro-Israel education than I had, and who really thought that they were doing a good thing, being the best Jewish versions of them that they could be by defending Israel, but they'd never met Palestinians. And I saw what happened over and over and over again when young Jewish students met Palestinians. And to their credit, I saw that they listened. And I began to see almost all the pro Israel leaders on my campus begin doing work for pro Palestinian human rights.